Outstanding. So good evening, everybody, from the the virtual world of HitLab, and welcome to our Information Mediary virtual seminar series on adherence. And the topic this evening that we'll be discussing is best practices in digital adherence technologies. A view from three different buyers. Again, we have a phenomenal panel this evening. Very, very honored to be moderating this. My name is Stan Kichnowski. I am the chair of HitLab, a leading digital health efficacy testing lab based in New York City and in India. I'm also the director of executive education at Columbia Business School, and very, very happy to be joined by an esteemed panel of presenters and talking about this important topic. It's not every day we get to have the perspectives of three different adherence executives from around the world. Their experiences have been global. Their experiences have been diverse relative to understanding adherence from the provider standpoint, from the pharmaceutical standpoint, from the payer standpoint. And just looking forward to having a wonderful conversation today. We still have attendees filtering into the virtual room. And while we are doing that, let's do some quick introductions first. And I'll just introduce you with name, title, and organization, and then I'll ask that you do a kind of a 1 or 2 minute overview of your background and your journey, if you will, for the audience. But let's start with Gorka. She's the Regional Global Markets and Business Director for Quest Diagnostics. Gorka, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Again, it's absolutely an honor and privilege to be here amongst, as you said as well, such an esteemed panel. Can you guys hear me? I hear an echo.
Yes, we can hear you. If everyone wants to mute their mics while someone else is talking, that might help.
So I manage our international clinical diagnostics business for Southeast Asia, India, Australia, and New Zealand for Quest Diagnostics. I've been with Quest now almost a year. And prior to that, I was with Edwards Life Sciences for 7 years in different roles. Not as long as that you've been with Merck. I thought 7 years was a long time. But I did global transparency operations, and then most recently clinical and business excellence for Edwards. And prior to that, spent over a decade in management consulting for Fortune 500 life sciences clients. So happy to be here.
Yeah, and happy to have you too. Again, it's wonderful. I know Quest has been in the middle of everything that's going on right now with the testing and just the pandemic here, particularly in the New York metropolitan area. So again, Gorka, welcome and thank you very much. And just again, to continue the conversations and the introductions, it's great to have Dr. Shalja Dixit, a Columbia alum and a former student of mine, also on the panel. Shalja has been an executive with numerous health organizations and life science companies over the last 20 years, starting with groups like Allergan and Sanofi and groups like Aetna and whatnot. So Shalja, if you could, she's currently on the chair of the faculty for Rutgers and the CMO and head of global innovation for Sutherland Healthcare. Shalja, if you could give us a little bit of a background on yourself as well, please. Shalja, you're on mute.
Yes, sorry. 6 p.m. syndrome, being on Zoom fatigue. So hello, everyone. Nice to meet you all, and thanks for inviting me. As Stan said, I am actually from Colombia and have known Stan for many years. I was a student as well at one point of time. So I'm a physician by background, have served in variety of role in provider side as well as payer side. Last few years actually on the pharma side, and then moving on to more of an innovation and my own consulting that I do. So happy to be here. Looking forward to talk and discuss more.
Wonderful, Shalja. Thank you very much for joining us again this evening. And last but not least is Matthew Moyer again. This is not his official 17th year anniversary at Merck, but this is close to it. Again, LinkedIn made the announcement earlier today, and it was funny given that he was actually going to be spending this evening with us. So he's effectively celebrating his Merck birthday, at least his LinkedIn dated Merck birthday, with us here tonight on this seminar panel. But Matt's the Director of Clinical Supply and Trial Technology at Merck. Matt, please, a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stan, and thanks for the kind introduction. I'll say, yeah, thank you for the recognition of the time at Merck as well. I actually started out with Merck in a very different role. My background is chemistry and pharmaceutical sciences. And so I started out first as a bench chemist and then as a project manager in the analytical space, and eventually moved to clinical supply in the supply chain and operations production focused role. And then eventually about 3 years ago, moved into an innovation focused role, recognizing that there are consumer grade and research grade technologies that could really improve the way that we conduct our clinical trials, the way that we engage with patients in our trials, and the data that we collect from trials to make it more valuable and allow us to make more rapid and informed decisions. And that's really where my journey in the current role started. So I've been doing that for about the last 3 years or so, and it's been an incredibly enriching experience. And thank you very much for the time to talk with you today.
Yeah, that's super. And we'll stick with you, Matt, while we'll dive into the first question here. And again, we have a phenomenal attendee list tonight. So attendees that are listening, we like to make this as interactive as possible. So please do feel free to write up any questions you have in the Q&A box in the Zoom page in front of you. And we will take those and make this very interactive. But, you know, Matt, really, I think we all know that adherence is a major issue right now, not just during the pandemic, but before the pandemic, and it'll obviously continue to be a major issue after the pandemic. It's a multi-billion-dollar, multi-hundred-billion-dollar global issue, and it's not just first-line medications for vaccinations or antibiotics, it's also medications around heart disease and diabetes and many other really significant and costly issues from a fatality standpoint and from a cost standpoint. From your perspective, how can healthcare providers and pharmacies and insurers really collectively maximize the medication adherence formula, and particularly during this COVID era where we need to be really astute about maintaining adherence to make sure that a lot of the comorbidities with COVID are managed properly and are adhered to?
Yes, certainly an excellent question. So a couple of things come to mind for me. One, maybe I'll preface it by saying that I work primarily in the clinical trial space, which folks believe to be a more controlled environment. I think generally speaking, that's true, but it also is very true that we have significant adherence issues and we make incredibly poor assumptions about patient adherence. I think, as I recall the numbers, you know, actual patient adherence in trial, and it depends by therapy, it depends by dosage regimen and things like that, can be 30 to 70%. And we're making critical decisions on dosing and on the viability of molecules with pretty flawed data. And what we recognize is that, you know, having a patient download an app and reminding them every 30 minutes to take a medication is not an effective way to go about doing this either. We need something that's appropriately linked to the patient's behavior and non-intrusive to their pattern, but will allow them the prompts when needed in order to improve their own adherence as they're in our trials. And what we've also found that's really important is the proactive engagement by site staff, by clinical site staff, to enable real-time follow-up in the case patients are having trouble maintaining adherence to therapy. I think that's really critical as well, that timely intervention in a meaningful way. Again, not triggered just based on some time-based reminder, but triggered based on the lack of patients following the regimen, I think is really important. And then finally, the last thing that comes to mind is ensuring that we've got a mechanism to facilitate that connection in potentially a remote way, especially given the pandemic and conditions. You know, we can't expect patients to be able to come to sites either because of travel restrictions or because, you know, they have their own, you know, personal challenges that they're dealing with. And so we need a mechanism to facilitate that discussion in a way that's acceptable to regulators, but that ultimately enables the ease of participation and maintenance in our trials.
From that perspective, Shalja and Gorka, what else would you want to add to that?
So, you know, one of the things that I at least have seen in my experience is this new concept of shared decision making, where patients are more and more in the center of the decision making process, especially within the clinical trial realm. And it's a very interesting phenomenon because it gives you a lot of data insights around what a clinician is looking for with regards to clinical outcomes and what a patient is looking for with regards to clinical outcomes. And many a times they're not the same things. So an interesting a point that we gathered when I was at AdWords was around, you know, clinicians are looking at the finite clinical outcomes of death, stroke, versus for a patient, it's more about the quality of life and being able to play with their grandchild as opposed to extension of their life. And so when you factor that in, you know, into the equation, the adherence concept will change because they're not going to adhere to something that they don't truly believe in because it doesn't align with their eventual outcome. So I think it's really important to consider and change our mindset as well within the industry of thinking of the patient more as a consumer and at the center of the equation, as opposed to the clinicians being the consumer and at the center of the equation. So it needs to be a two-pronged approach. That's just been my experience, at least on the clinical side.
That's fantastic. And Shalja, you've worked across medical systems as an MD. You've worked with some of the biggest payers and health insurers in the country, and also some of the biggest pharma in the world. What's your perspective on this?
So, of course, you know, as you said, like adherence happens to be one of the biggest problem, not just bad outcomes, but it's also a sunk cost, right? If patients don't take medication, they don't show an impact. I think one thing out of all the craziness and this pandemic has done is we were always thinking about use of telemedicine or technology, right? But this pandemic has accelerated some of that use. So because we were forced to use it in health system, if I may say, what it has done, we all know that, you know, continuum of care is a big problem. So as soon as the patient leaves the four wall of office, half of the things, the continuation of care doesn't happen. So usage of technology that we are seeing today is I think going to have a larger impact on ensuring that we have more adherence and compliance. And I fully agree. I think it also gives a control and brings patient in the mix in the decision-making, because they are able to make sure that they are managing their condition even beyond when they leave their the office of their physician or hospital and so on. So a big unmet need, but I think usage of technology that we are seeing in last few months is, I hope it continues even beyond pandemic, the adoption that we have seen, that's going to ensure and hopefully have an answer to some degree to non-adherence that we have seen.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic has obviously just driven adherence down for a number of reasons. Matt, what's been some of the things that you've seen Merck do as a response to this, and some of the health systems that you've worked with as a response to this?
Yeah, I guess you can certainly consider that our trials are global in nature, right? And so that you've seen the kind of slow filtration of the pandemic, you know, first in China and then across Europe and now eventually in the US and the rest of the globe as well. I think we've certainly tried to enable digital approaches wherever possible, recognizing that either it's not desired to or it's not possible for the patient to travel to the site. And as it's been mentioned before, telemedicine has been a big piece of that, either leveraging sites' capability to already perform telemedicine or providing some environment, some vendor solution to enable that connection. We've also looked very aggressively at the capability for remote patient monitoring in the event that we need to have a virtual visit done, that we can do that in a relatively seamless way for the patient, that the data, vital statistics, other content that needs to be collected can be done so remotely.
That's enormous. And from your perspective, Gorka, what is Quest doing as a provider, really, as one of the world's biggest labs and certainly the biggest in the United States, to help improve adherence during the pandemic, if nothing else, adherence toward testing, and what are some of the digital technologies that they've deployed to help improve adherence as well on the testing side?
Yeah, I think what the pandemic has done for us, and I'm a glass half full kind of person in any case, but has created a lot of opportunities. And one of them being the focus on health and wellness. So Quest has been a very active participant in health and wellness realm. And through a couple of different channels, one through employers by offering what we call Blueprint for Wellness, which is biometric screening for their employees to keep your employee population healthy. And that has a lot of positive impacts. But then also through Quest Direct, as at least in the US, you as an individual can order tests and get results through an app called MyQuest. So just the ease of use. And the beauty of all of this is the data that you get is A, actionable, and B, easily digestible by a common person. And so I think with COVID-19, what's happened is the focus now is everybody wants to obviously have a stronger immune system, be healthier, be more focused on, if there are things that they can prevent, to focus on those preventative techniques. And like I will give you a great example, and this kind of ties in with adherence. So I took the Blueprint for Wellness that Quest Diagnostic offers, and my vitamin D levels were low, which predominantly almost everybody has low vitamin D levels. But the impact of low vitamin D levels is on bone health, and now it's related to a slew of different things. So the prescription for that was an over-the-counter, just supplement. Now I consider myself healthy. I consider myself a fairly well-informed individual, but I cannot keep up on a consistent basis with taking my supplement. Now, this is not a chronic illness. This is more preventative. But my point being that, there needs to be more tools and technologies that are geared towards preventative maintenance as well, that would be focused on individuals without creating noise within the continuum of unnecessary alerts. But I think Quest is playing a huge role, but there's definitely an unmet need within the digital technology space that still needs to be played out. And then obviously there are the other buckets. One we've already spoken about, which is the clinical trial bucket. And then there's the other chronic illness bucket that we're doing a lot of different, stuff in. So, but health and wellness, definitely COVID-19 has put a focus on.
That's fantastic. And I think, when we look at a lot of the innovations that are coming out right now in healthcare, they're focused on adherence, whether it's an app or whether it's a device. Even Alexa is trying to get people to take their medications. So we're seeing it come from like new robots that are sitting in your kitchen counter to things that are sitting on your smartphone. Shelja, again, with your cross-industry, your cross-sector experience within the healthcare industry, what would you tell some of our startups that are here tonight amongst the attendees that they need to be aware of? And what are some of the ROI calculations that either life science executives or managed care executives or hospital executives are thinking about when they're trying to determine whether they should engage a startup to come in and help improve their non-adherence formula, if you will. And just a reminder, you're on mute.
Yeah. So yeah, again, I think there are few things, I'll also add to the list actually that was mentioned. One important component that has also happened with pandemic is focus on behavioral health, right? And if you think about it, behavioral health plays a role into a lot of like non-adherence aspects, because we have talked about many chronic conditions for years and years, but there is a behavioral health underlying component to some degree to every chronic condition that we have not recognized. But what it has done is that, okay, there is isolation and a lot of things are happening. Behavioral health has become front and center as well. So I'll just add to that list. So answering your question about what exactly life sciences company, I think when I talk to the life sciences company, one thing which is becoming big is beyond the pill approach, right? So we all understand that just having a pill is not the be all end all solution. They need like an ecosystem, which is the reminder system and other aspects around that. So that is one thing that you need to think about, that how does that ecosystem of beyond the pill works. One important component is from the beginning, thinking about the business model, right? That's really important, that how exactly the technology that you have in your startup is going to fit into the larger, I always say this, that this is a pie, you can't add to the pie. It has to be the zero sum game, meaning like you have to take away the waste. The technology cannot be an add-on. So for anyone in the healthcare system, be it like life sciences company, be it payer world, one of the key important component is that technology has to prove with evidence that it's taking away the waste, and it has to be based on evidence rather than adding the cost of technology. So think about that early on, like how you are going to enable and make sure that the technology is fitting into ecosystem. Second important component I want to mention is, many times a lot of these technology and applications don't work in my mind because they have not integrated in the workflow. What I mean by that is you need to make sure that technology is not taking away I'm a physician by training, so I have a little bias maybe here. It's not taking away that care provider relationship. The adherence, if you think that adherence can, there are a lot of studies that you can strengthen that relationship to strengthen the adherence, but not bypass it, right? Because there's a trusted relationship. So make sure when you are thinking about a technology that it is somehow enabling, or provider or care team is in the mix, while adding other components, of course, your family, your circle, trusted circle, and whatnot. So that's another thing I would say. So think about the business model, think about like how you are adding the value early on in your business model to an already expensive or strenuous healthcare system, and not adding on the cost of technology. Second thing, as I said, I'll just repeat, making sure early on that the technology is fitting into the workflow from provider component as well as patient as well, And the third important aspect is, we talk about digital and all the technology, but there is an adherence to the technology as well. So whatever you're making, it has to be engaging enough that patient or has a reason to go to that application, to go to that technology and leverage that technology. Or if you don't do that and understand I think this was mentioned, understand the patient, what their goal is, right? It may not be necessarily getting your hemoglobin A1C down. It may be like playing with your grandkids, right? So if you don't make sure that, if it becomes just a clinical tool or a device rather than an engagement tool, then I don't think so these technologies will drive adherence, So that, I think I'm big on understanding the patient journey, the patient aspect for these technologies. So those are three things I would say, for any technology company thinking about it.
Yeah.
And if I could just add, I'm going to say I completely resonate with what you just said. We in industry do a lot of these voice of customer surveys, and I think doing voice of customer surveys on patients is equally important. It's not something that is done often enough. And then, to the point you made about technology, I would just say there's no one size fits all. So given my global mandate, you step outside the United States and the equation is very different. from country to country based on cultural, language, reimbursement, the medication that is available in that region, etc. All those parameters also then play a huge role. So I think considering all of that is really important at the onset, if possible.
Absolutely. And Matt, again, when you probably see a lot of startups, you probably see a lot of new tech coming to Merck on a regular basis, trying to do something with supply chain, trying to do something in the supply chain, trying to do something with adherence. What advice do you give them when they're coming, for folks, again, that are on the call that would actually be able to utilize going forward from the Merck perspective and from the supply chain perspective about being prepared and actually coming to you with the right information so that you're actually able to help them and hopefully engage them in a pilot or some sort of study?
Yeah, I mean, I guess a couple of things come to mind. The first I'd say is recognize your own strengths and know what you don't know. One of the biggest takeaways that I've had over the couple of years in doing this is the complexity of deploying a technology in the trial ecosystem acceptable to a regulator is very complicated. And the regulatory component is a strength of my company, but the technology is not. And so what we like to do is we like to partner with those who have very effective and potentially revolutionary technologies that might benefit our patients or benefit our understanding of the drug, allow them to do their thing, and we can help them translate their content into a package of material that's acceptable to use in a regulatory, in a double-blind clinical trial, which not all tech vendors are very comfortable or aware of the restrictions or requirements. The second thing, and this goes back to a point that Gorka made, was, trials are often global in nature, and so recognize that just this simple, what sounds like a simple piece of deploying the technology across borders can be very challenging. This is not a tech example, but to give you an example of the complexity, if we're working on a vaccine that contains an infectious agent as a base to it, and we need to transfer that vaccine from border across country, across Europe, we need to clear customs on every country that we fly over in the event that there's some sort of catastrophic issue that occurs with the airplane and the airplane goes down in that country. So not exactly analogous to what we're talking about here, but just the idea that it's not nearly as simple as it might seem on the surface. And again, allow us to be the strength there and facilitate those discussions, but recognize that there is complexity built into that. The other piece too is, and this is probably more of a challenge for me, is ensuring that we approach this from the right business perspective. So, we're looking for return on investment, and that may be dollars. It may also be quality of patients' experience in our trials and the ability to recruit those patients in the future, or patients like them in the future. And so recognizing that the business case needs to be built for technology deployment, and it may start with something as simple as a one-site small-scale pilot study, and we need to build a body of evidence to take to leadership to buy into the approach. And it's not always the fastest journey in the world. So I would stress patience as well, patience, no pun intended, CE as opposed to IENTS. I think that's really important. But the goal really is ultimately to look at what will the technology do to improve the trial, improve the patient's experience in the trial, or improve our understanding of the data coming from the trial. And as long as we begin with that as a grounding in reality, we can typically build the bridges to other deployment questions, return questions, and things like that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Gorka and Shalja, I can see you wanting to bust in there too. Gorka, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I completely agree. I was just nodding my head because I agree with everything that Matt's saying.
Fantastic. Shalja?
No, I was just like, agreeing with what Matt said. It looks easier. Patience is important. I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And so going along those lines, given how I think just in this first half hour, everyone has really gotten an understanding of just how complicated adherence is. Let's dive into that, because now it went from complicated about 8 months ago now to hyper complicated in the pandemic. Matt, I never even thought about planes flying overhead with stuff and then needing to get clearance internationally. I mean, this sounds like something out of some kind of a Steven Seagal movie or something. I have no idea, but you know, I think the idea is that you know, we're in this you know, super complex area now, and you know, what kind of technologies can make a difference? And Shalja, we'll start with you, and then again go around the table, the virtual table, as it were. But what technologies have you seen become and really be the most diffusive to help medication adherence? I mean, we've got these you know, kind of you know, smart packs. You've got smart bottles. You've got Alexa and Google telling you to take stuff. You've got you know, people calling you on the phone from care management companies and health companies. You've got apps, all those sorts of things. What have you seen that's really worked the best?
Yeah, so I think Stan, what works the best, kind of jury is still out, if I may say, right? Because we are seeing some of these, and I think it was mentioned before, I fully agree. There is not one solution that fits all, right? It's very cultural, patient dependent, disease dependent, right? So there are a lot of things that play into it. But few things which I find interesting that are picking up, and I hear from people are working nicely. I think one is this telemedicine. You know, we are seeing a little bit of a lift in that, and I hope that continues. You know, for very long as industry, we have struggled with the right business model and adoption of telemedicine. Technology was always there. So I think that has become this. I talked to some of my practicing physician colleagues. They say, oh, it's wonderful, I can have this 10-minute chat, like, you know, with my patient, and just to do a quick 10-15-minute telemedicine and remind my you know, Medicare heart failure patient that they just need to do things right. I mean, you know, versus calling them for an office visit, you know, and they, this is like a 75, 80, 90-year-old, you know, then there is a transport thing, who's bringing them to the office thing. So that I think is a wonderful way. If the patient is steady state, you know, you do a quick telemedicine. And many of my friends actually, practicing physician, they said, well, pandemic or no pandemic, I plan to have one day in the week as my telemedicine office hours, right? And this is going to be all my well patients. I just call them 15-minute, and then I just tell them boom, 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 what to do, you know, and they hear from their physician, friendly face, you know, trusted care team, and this. So I think that's one thing, Stan, that I hope continue to keeps on happening, and I think is having an impact, I hear. Second is, I believe that there a lot of these digital applications, but I think the trick there is understanding the patient, right? Not just a app that sends text reminder, but rather something that you know, is becomes my behavior, right? I mean, adherence is all about behavior. So if it becomes something like Twitter, Facebook, which we use every day and we cannot detach ourselves, that's what these applications need to become. You know, if I think a patient is less likely to go to an application which is a medication reminder application rather than an application that becomes way of life. So that's another thing that we are seeing. The third component, I just want to emphasize on that. One interesting thing that I see happening is focus on behavioral health, right? And when I say behavioral health, it's many aspects which we have ignored for so long in chronic condition. I'll be first one to admit, many times in our training, in fact, we are not trained very well to talk about that behavioral components, right? You know, so that has become very important because that is in front and center. And I hope that continues through these applications, and many of these digital applications are very well positioned to take care of those things. So few things.
Yeah, I'd love to see, Matt, again, from your perspective, you're in the middle of it all. And what are you seeing coming through that you're really impressed with?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with what Shalja said, as far as, you know, certainly it not being one size fits all. The capability of the technology to connect with the patient in an appropriate fashion, I think, is really important. Or maybe even not connect with the patient. And I'll give you an example there. So we may choose an active, engaging technology with a patient population or with a trial design that requires or has high risk for the patient to become, to discontinue in trial. Or if it's if it's a phase 3 study, you know, just prior to market, in a broad population, we may want to choose a fully passively monitoring technology to just understand passively adherence and then leverage the clinical site to provide that intervention when the patient returns to clinic, somewhat mimicking a patient's visit to their physician in the real world. You know, there are different implications from a regulatory perspective on how you position the technology and its impact to be seen or not be seen with the drug as some kind of combination product. So it's just an important consideration from a drug development perspective. But speaking solely from a technology, from a patient perspective and use of technology, you know, we never want it to be intrusive, and we want the technology to learn and interact with the patient in a way that's reflective of their adherence pattern. So if they're doing well, if they can fully, you know, remember what they need to do as part of the trial, we don't want to bother them with needless reminders.
Yeah, and that's really something I think, you know, we see a lot across the digital health spectrum. Physicians get message fatigue from electronic health record messages. We're seeing patients get message fatigue. Even a grant we did in Ghana with the Grameen Foundation, the Gates Foundation, about 6 years ago now, when we were doing voice messages to moms, reminding them to get their kids vaccinated and use clean water tools and use mosquito netting, so that the death rate from, you know, with the 0 to 5-year-olds would be substantially reduced. They stopped answering the messages. They as soon as they heard a robotic voice or a pre-recorded public health nurse, they just hung up. So it was very clear that message fatigue is something that I think we suffer from the age of 2, when our parents are telling us stop touching that, or don't go there, don't do that, to the age of whenever, when we're told to do something a little bit too much, and that's obviously something we don't want to have to hear all the time as well. We actually do have some great questions coming in from the gallery. And again, if you're in the gallery, please feel free to submit any questions either through the chat box privately or publicly, or through LinkedIn. You can, if you want to send me something through LinkedIn, I'm always on that nowadays. But one of the questions that came in from Greg, what are some of the considerations that we need to take into account based on what phase a trial is currently in with medication adherence? And are there any adherence factors that we got to think about, whether it's phase 1, 2, or 3? And in terms of phase 4, how does this adherence affect a post-marketing aftermarket kind of phase 4 study? And you know, Gorka, you're up next, and you know, again, we'll toss that over to you.
Sure. So I think Matt is the resident clinical trial expert here, but just based on my experience, I'll take a shot at the question. So I think Shelja pointed this out. I think it depends on the product in question. What is, for example, you know, if you're taking an anticoagulant drug for a heart valve device or heart valve disease, I would say that and you have to take it on an ongoing basis. It doesn't matter what phase of the trial it is. The impact and the outcome is so life and death that adherence is uber important. And because of that, I think you need more, not just digital technology, but on-site monitoring and in-person monitoring. You need to put more tools in play versus something like diabetes. Again, it depends on type 1 or type 2, but so I think that plays a role. And then on, I sent mine to the garage. So as far as phase 4 is concerned, I would say, you know, it also depends on your strategy of if you're going to do indication expansion based on what's coming out of phase 4. And adherence for that then will be a huge factor, but I'll punt it back to Matt and see what his response is.
Yeah, I thought for sure that question was coming my way. So you think about the structure of phase 1 studies. So they're typically inpatient, very often inpatient. And so the value of adherence monitoring when you can otherwise do directly observed therapy because the patient is in clinic anyway, probably a little less so, though we do tend to use phase 1 as a means to test the technology out. It allows us to get a little bit of user experience information and also get us some experience from a site perspective on how the technology deploys, how seamlessly it does, how the help desk support is when things inevitably go wrong, and things like that. Phase 2 is, I think, our bread and butter in terms of really wanting to better understand the adherence of patients and its influence on efficacy and safety of the drug, because we're making decisions like what's the right dosage regimen, what's the dose, the minimum efficacious dose, what are AEs and SAEs, and what's important, and at what level do they occur, and so on and so forth. And so we see, and phase 2 is often outpatient, so patients are given supplies and they leave, and are gone for a period of time, and they come back to the clinic eventually. And that's a black box in terms of what happens, in between those times. And so that's your best possible opportunity. Phase 3 is where we view more of a passive monitoring opportunity, primarily because we want to ensure that we decouple the medication adherence tool from the effect of the drug in a broad population, because that typically comes up as a question during the filing process. And because based on past experience, and I'll give you an example. So Otsuka's product Abilify used Proteus ingestible sensor. You may not be familiar with it. Essentially, it was co-formulated with the drug, and when the patient ingested the tablet broke down, activated the sensor. Stomach acid activated the sensor, and it sent a signal to a patch that the patient wore. Well, not only did that, it went to market, it was approved by the FDA, but what's important to note is that they didn't receive any expanded label indication as a result of that approval. So in other words, the FDA didn't view that and the body of data that was provided along with that filing in any additional value, from a pharmaceutical perspective than the drug by itself. So it just speaks to the thoughtful process of deployment of adherence technologies for return, and in terms of and why we focus more on the early to mid clinical phases for deployment of these, to accelerate decision making and to help better our trials in that space, as opposed to thinking about it from a phase 3 or post-market perspective.
Brilliant. No, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you, Matt. I can tell that you do this for a living. That was great. And, again, Shalja, so much of the research that you've done over the last, 20 years, I won't give away exactly how many years, but just a lot of years since you were my student back about 5 years ago in your early days. A lot of what you've done, whether it's been with managed care or pharma or hospitals, has been around trying to figure out the medication adherence conundrum. And what's your point here? What are you thinking?
So just elaborating on what Matt said, and of course he is definitely the resident here with all the expertise. But one of the things is, phase 3, you're putting an adherence tool in phase 3, you have to, it dilutes the endpoint that pharma company is looking at. And then you have to talk about, because we are looking at cause and effect at that point, right? They are meant for a specific purpose. So in phase 2, you can test those, as Matt said. And then I am really big on phase 4 studies. So these can be in many ways pragmatic trial design, observational studies. I think phase 4 again is a really good place to come back and test the adherence tool. Yes, the important component here is there can be many different types of phase 4. So you can have to show the delta benefit over a particular innovation or an asset that pharma company is working on, you definitely need to have probably a separate arm, to show that. And sometimes the dilemma is that if you do that, what's the impact on a newly approved, possibly, drug and whatnot, right? So there is a little bit of a navigation there, but definitely I think adherence tools should be tested in a real world environment for sure, because after you're testing in phase 2, phase 3 is always a question mark, as I said, because there is a very specific purpose. A lot of investment goes in, and these are big studies, and you have to be very careful about how you're designing, how you're powering those studies, how you're collecting the data. But phase 4, again, companies should think about how exactly to test adherence tool in real world.
And so I think, just straight out of the box, we got another question from the gallery, Matt. It's around now AI. And so, I think everyone is using the term AI. It's obviously, depending on the computer scientist you talk to and the machine engineer that you talk to, machine learning might be the right might be the terminology, machine learning, not AI. So I think the question from the gallery is, how much AI right now are you seeing? And let's call it machine learning as well, just to be fair. How much machine learning are you seeing in the supply chain, in the medication packaging, and that sort of world, given that you're on the front lines of that stuff?
Yeah, and so two things to know about Merck, and I'm sure about other pharma companies too. One, we love acronyms, and so we abbreviate everything. And two, we like to amalgamate acronyms. So I'd heard for a number of weeks the term AIML, and I'm like, I got to figure out what that is. And so that's AI, machine learning. We've just decided to combine the two terms together, even though they do mean two somewhat different things. But to actually answer the question, so I mean, I guess I would say, I think there are a couple of things that are important, and we're just kind of dipping our toe into the AI/ML space, and more around things like automated tumor imaging and things of that nature, as opposed to the adherence space. But I think you can apply those principles to better understand and predict adherence patterns in trials, given certain circumstances. And I think there might be value there. Not that it's a baked cake necessarily, but there's some opportunity in that space. I think it also might allow us then to predict folks that are more likely to have trouble in the trial environment and who are more likely to discontinue in the trial or minimally become non-adherent to therapy. I think that represents an opportunity for us to apply those principles and broad-scale data analysis to help kind of predict and get in front of and help ultimately patients who might be beginning to show signs of non-adherence or disengagement with the trial.
I think one of the other things, at least what we're seeing with Quest, and this is the beauty of diagnostic data and so many data points that you collect on patients, is patient selection at the onset of trials. So site selection and also patient selection when clinical trials get initiated. So it's not just 100% relying on the sites to bring in the patients, but leveraging the data from a diagnostic insight perspective, and then being able to be more precise with regards to site and patient selection. And, I don't know whether it's the AI component or the machine learning component that would help with that, but definitely there's a huge data lake.
I'll just add to what you said. I think, Stan, AI, ML or ML, we are definitely, I won't say in the actual application of the trial itself, but to make trial efficient, right? If there is a box around it, that's where we are seeing more of an usage of analytics and ML. One is absolutely site selection and making sure that, because, as the parameters become more complex and some of the newer innovation that we are seeing, if you call it immuno-oncology and all those kind of things, there are like a lot of very specific parameters. And many of these, as we move towards precision medicine, you are looking for precise patient parameters too. Exactly. So that's where lab data and many data points are coming into play. And, site selection and patient selection, it is playing a very important role. Another component is I'm also seeing it so that's like efficiency, if I may say, the operational component of the trial design. Also, I'm seeing it a little bit of better understanding of the outcomes part. So a lot of things around helping in the trial design is where we are seeing application of AI, ML, not necessarily so much in the trial itself, but things that are surrounding the trial is where we are seeing a lot of application. Imaging is a very good point. I think one of the broadest application we are seeing is in imaging area for sure.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think to build on a term. Sorry, Stan. I was just going to say to build on a term that Garpa used, the data lake, right? So as we begin to aggregate and collect more and more data from patients in our trials, the ability to perform longitudinal analyses across trials to help better elucidate trends, even minor trends that might be magnified as you begin to increase the sample size, I think is really important to us as well. So you think about digital biomarkers and other things that are collected from patients during the trial. I think those become even more powerful as you begin to sample from a larger sample size across a broader range of time and across a broader patient population, inclusive of across studies.
Yeah.
Right, and I mean, so we're kind of partnering with a big pharma company right now, and when you add the layer of going global, it gets even more interesting. And typically, how trials get conducted, if it's a U.S.-centric pharma company, they start with the U.S. first, and then move into the trial because of different strategic reasons as well, into different geographic locations. However, we're seeing a trend now where there are certain, depending on the product, there are certain trials where they want to go global from the get-go in how the trial is structured. And so in that aspect, patient selection and enrollment become critical because you need to enroll in a certain span of time for trial to be effective. And then, that has downstream impact if it doesn't happen in a timely fashion. So all the more reason to have those insights for patients that are OUS to get them through the door for your particular therapy or trial.
Yeah, and I think sticking with you, Gorka, I mean, you've done a lot with behavioral change, and you've done a lot with trying to understand how adherence is really a behavior, persuasion, and technique, and a challenge. And so tell us a little bit about this. I always tell people I wish I'd gotten a PhD in psychology and not medical technology, because everything I've done over the last 30 years is really about trying to change behavior with digital technology tools. And what have you learned? Tell us a little bit about behavioral change and what you've learned on your journey.
Sure. I can tell you that I feel we've just scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn. I mean, say COVID-19 in itself and the focus on mental health, because of COVID-19 is a huge component of, again, if you have mental health issues, you stop taking your medication in a timely fashion, then that has an impact, or you stop going to the doctor, then that has an impact on, just disease management, et cetera, et cetera. So I would personally say that there are different buckets. There are certain folks that have made wellness the cornerstone of their existence, and everything around from exercise to taking in the right supplements to whether it is telemedicine and consulting, that's a focus. There are other folks that have gone on the complete opposite side, right, with regards to the impacts just of COVID-19. But if you take that out of the mix, one of the things that, at least what we've seen, and I've seen in my experience, is, treating the patient as a consumer and making it easy, bringing the test to the patient. So a great example is what Quest Diagnostic has done with what we call gap in care solutions, like Ensure One. So it is a diagnostic test that is non-invasive for colorectal cancer screening that you can take within the four walls of your house. So now it allows more people to get that screening done, because the new mandate is 45 and above, everybody should get that screening. And if you do take that screening, the chances, if you detect it early, it's 90% survival rate. If you detect it late, it's 10% survival rate, right? So imagine the impact, and the differential is the ease of use. I don't want to go to a doctor. I don't want an invasive procedure. And so I think that is a huge behavioral component that if more and more companies can focus on, which is the ease of use for the patient, we'll see a lot better adherence, is my 2 cents.
I love it. Matt, any comments on that, given that obviously this is something you work on every day?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and this is maybe tangential to adherence, though it has an adherence component to it. One of the technologies that we believe in strongly is the ability for patients to remotely sample their own blood for analysis purposes. And so, I think nobody obviously likes a venous blood draw, right? And if we can abbreviate that process, make it painless or near so for the patient, have that blood collected remotely, one, it allows us to sample more frequently if needed. 2, it allows the patient to avoid a site visit simply for a venous blood draw. 3, it allows the blood to actually be transported in a more stable fashion and potentially without the need for dry ice or other stabilizing techniques. It's a really fascinating technology, and one example of technology that we're deploying to try and move the trial more to the patient, make the trial more patient-centric as opposed to site-centric.
And Shalja, we got about a couple minutes left here. Bring us home. What's your behavioral modification secret?
I think, one of the things is there is stigma attached to behavior, right? So one of the very important component with a lot of these technologies that we are seeing is that the skepticism can be taken away. So although we are addressing behavioral component, it has to be addressed in a way that the patient doesn't have stigma attached to it. That's an important component, that this is something meant for you. We meet where the patient is. This is achieving your life goal, rather than saying that, oh, we are here to treat some behavioral component now through an app, right? I mean, I'm less likely, how many of us know that we have to exercise, but still don't get motivated to that, right? So there is a component that needs to be embedded in the daily activity. I can't emphasize enough meeting the patient where they are, bringing patient centricity, and adjusting, fitting in the workflow rather than creating which is out of that usually, to modify the behavioral and address that, we need to understand the behavior and make sure that it becomes a behavioral habit. Habits are difficult to break. So you have to make these things a habit of a patient, of a person, then only you see a long-term uptake of those. So.
Absolutely. Well, look, that is our panel for tonight. And again, I can't thank you all enough. Again, Gorka, Shalja, and Matt, of all nights, but on your Merck birthday night, happy 17 years again for those attendees who joined late. Just incredible lessons learned. And for everybody who's attending, please remember to join us again for the IMC seminar series on Thursday, August 20th, 6 p.m. The same bat time, the same bat channel. We look forward to seeing everyone back here at that time. In the meantime, thank you, Information Media Corporation, for your generous sponsorship for this seminar series. And thank you, Gorka, Shalja, and Matt, for sharing an evening with us to discuss these important issues, especially in this really difficult time. So everyone, have a good night and stay safe.
Thank you.